Welcome to the State of the Markets podcast. I'm Paul Rodriguez of thinktrading.com.
I'm Tim Price of pricevaluepartners.com.
And our very special guest is Robbie Miles. Robbie Miles, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Paul and Tim. And I'll just say that I've been listening to State of the Markets for 5 years now, and I really appreciate Tim's humour and conviction, and Paul, you're a great interviewer, so it's been a rewarding.
5 years, you don't get that for murder these days. Actually, under Labour government, you never will now.
Well, that's...
my name is, who is it? Who is the script writer for Blackadder? My name is Ben Elton. Good night, mic drop.
Yeah. Thank you, Robbie. That's very kind. It's very nice to hear that. And it's actually lovely that we've got a lot of long-term listeners. So for all those long-term listeners out there, thank you so much for sticking with us. And Robbie, but this is about you. Tell us about yourself and tell a bit about your financial background, which is how our paths have crossed, and a bit about the exciting project.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I've been working in an institutional investor for 11 years as a portfolio manager, before that as an analyst, and always focused on the intersection between sustainability and finance. And we can come into that a bit more later. But the reason I got into that line of work was actually because of growing up in a nature reserve in the Norfolk Broads, a very unique place where my dad was a tenant farmer, so quite difficult to make a living, especially because there was so much wildlife around. And my great uncle was he was the steward, the National Trust had owned the land for 100 years or so, but he's still living there. And this was very formative because we had cranes fly in from Europe, having been extinct from the UK for 200 years. Our family culture was really focused around a love of wildlife. And my dad's difficulty of making a living, having to use pesticides, fertilizers, seeing the insect population drop off a cliff for doing so, and even then barely making a profit. It was very formative to try and, for me, to try and find an answer to how wildlife can thrive. I was very focused on that one topic of wildlife and how humans can thrive as well. And so I was probably quite early and authentic to this surge of sustainable investing that kind of happened to coincide with the beginning of my career, which is quite fortunate. And never actually found particularly good answers to this question of how the two can thrive in conjunction with each other, but loved being a portfolio manager. I don't think there's any better job for having a crow's nest view of what's going on in the world and trying to understand it from an objective perspective, because you don't get paid for having views that are not right.
That's your central bank.
You barely...
Yeah, but that's not really portfolio management.
Well, even then your views are not right. But yes, exactly. And then managed to get an opportunity to move out to San Francisco with the company in 2017. And as maybe as the universe works, the answer came in the least expected place from a climate change skeptic. I don't think he believes that there is a risk in climate change at all. And I'm a bit like a bull to a red flag with those kind of contrarian views, not because I want to necessarily prove myself right, but I do love the discussion. And we had a very respectful multi-month conversation about climate change. And I had to concede at the end of it that my solution of empowering a central power to tax and subsidize our way to a solution was not working. It hadn't worked for 36 years. That was when a guy called James Hansen testified to Congress that climate change was a risk in 1988. And that expecting it to work suddenly now would be a little bit mad, but that's what everyone does expect. So that got me into the world of Murray Rothbard, and that just felt like water in the desert. I couldn't believe that this stuff had been evading me for so many years.
So
And
Murray Rothbard, that doesn't, it kind of rings a bell, but I don't know what that is. Could you just explain who he is and why he's significant?
yeah, Tim, do you know who he is?
Libertarian journalist is my presumption.
He's an author and a professor, I think, but he probably wrote articles as well. He wrote a book. He's written a few books. For a New Liberty, Anatomy of the State, and he's just an amazing thinker, and one of those people that I think is just so overlooked as a scholar.
I think of him as Austrian. I don't know if that's a fair Austrian economist.
Yeah,
I don't know if
he's
that's
Austrian,
fair.
yeah.
Someone has recommended his work. That's why it rings a bell. I'm trying to think who, but yeah. Okay.
I find it very accessible. It was very very easy to get into, but totally, it just brought to life a totally new world, and generally met a lot of libertarians. But there was something about libertarianism that didn't quite resonate from my more progressive conditioning, and I think it was just this attitude of don't tread on me, and this kind of this righteousness that was somewhat well founded, but energetically didn't seem to work, because very few people are libertarians, even though essentially all they're saying is you shouldn't aggress against people. So it's a very agreeable premise to build a philosophy around, but there are very few libertarians. So why is that? And I think it's because they just haven't won the hearts and minds. And then I came across a guy called Mark Victor, who founded Live and Let Live, and this is when I really felt like I'd found my home and the answer to this question of how wildlife, how nature and humanity can thrive together, which is combining this one rule that we shouldn't aggress against each other with a recognition that alone doesn't lead to a peaceful society, but we can't prescribe what else is needed. For us in Live and Let Live, it's honesty, kindness, tolerance, civility, open-mindedness, seeking kind of win-win outcomes and helping those that are not as fortunate as ourselves, but not forcing that on anyone else, just doing that because there's joy in being able to do that. And that's it leads to a happier, more interdependent life. And then volunteered for Live and Let Live whilst I was doing the portfolio manager job. For the last 5 years, sitting on the council, we've been stress testing the message for those 5 years, and then left my portfolio manager role a couple of weeks ago, to run Live and Let Live. Very, very flattered to be asked to run it by Mark, because I was just so enthusiastic, and I think he saw in me an ability to appeal to both ends of the political spectrum. You know, I can speak to the central banker skeptics, as well as the rights of LGBTQ people and those that want a non-racist and integrated society. So I'm really not polarized. And when people tell me that the world's falling apart because of the red party or the blue party that's in power, I tend to not agree with that. I think these things are much more systemic, they're much more deep rooted than the political figurehead that's representing either of those parties. And I think what attracts me to Live and Let Live is that it really does address the root of the problem and proposes a practical path forward.
So I think you left us sort of dangling on a cliff edge. So I think we were left with and the conclusion is, and the solution is ...
Yeah, the problem I think is extremely clear, which is that we have no respect for a truth that we hold to be self-evident, which is that each of us is free. And from that truth that we hold to be self-evident, same words as the Declaration of Independence, there is one human right that is consistent and coherent in all time and place, which is that we should be free from aggression of other people. So Live and Let Live basically says that each of us should be free to live our lives as we choose without compromising anyone else's ability to do the same. And you may be thinking, well, what's that got to do with climate change? Well, climate change was the gateway, and the problems that this solves is much deeper than just climate change. Climate change is a failure to enforce property rights. If climate change is a problem, and I respect that people have different views on that. I've had lots of conversations about this and haven't been persuaded the other way, but respect that basically no one's assessed the evidence in a courtroom, and until we do that, we all of us, like the pandemic, like so many issues, we're sort of armchair scholars. And
sorry to interrupt, when you say climate change, do you mean climate change as in the climate is changing, which I don't think anyone would necessarily disagree with because it always has, or are you saying that there is a principle known as anthropogenic climate change, namely that human activity is changing the climate of the earth?
Yeah, the latter. And most of the people, so I had a conversation with people like Tom Luongo on this, who's also skeptical on the risks. He concludes that anthropogenic climate change is happening. It's just a question of materiality. So is shutting off the world's fossil fuels a net benefit if climate change is solved? And this is where I think the question is posed as it's kind of the wrong question to ask, because if we are simply not polluting against each other, we're not trespassing against each other, we don't have to stop burning fossil fuels. We have to sequester the carbon, and we have to, much like we sequester the sulfuric acid and the soot.
But isn't carbon good for the environment, though?
Yeah, water is good for the body, but there's a quantity of water that is too much for the body. So it's all about.
As Albert Bartlett said, for any entity beyond maturity, further growth is either obesity or cancer. So we accept there are limits beyond which it is unwise to travel.
Yeah, exactly. And what those limits are is something that needs to be assessed in a courtroom, because there is a concept of de minimis. And so if you're having a barbecue and a little bit of the barbecue smoke is going to your neighbor, should we cage you for that activity? Obviously not. But if the property is being damaged in a material way, like your house on the coast is being washed away, and it wouldn't have been if the globe greenhouse gas emissions hadn't happened, then that's a trespass. So in some ways, I don't really want to get into a climate debate because
because you come to the wrong
I don't know about
podcast, Robbie.
Well, I anticipated this, and I think there's just so much other stuff we can discuss. And frankly, if there was climate scientists on the call and there was a differing in perspective of those climate scientists, that might be a really rich discussion. But we're all finance people, sure. and so we might just find that I'm willing to accept that I might be wrong, and I really hope I am wrong. But it's kind of immaterial for Live and Let Live. And in fact, there are people in Live and Let Live who don't think climate change is a problem, and people that do. So it doesn't define who we are. It's just the journey that got me to it.
I think part of the problem here is that people believe that people who say that there isn't there is climate change, but it's not anthropogenic. People who say that are just quite happy for companies to pollute the environment and to pollute the seas.
I think, sorry to cut in again, Paul, but I think there's two different things here that are being conflated. One is, let's say, the whole question of climate change, to what extent is it happening, and if it is, and I think probably all of us accept that it is, then what are the causes, and is human behaviour impacting that? And there's a wholly separate argument, which is, should we care for the environment? And the latter question, you think any rational person will say, well, you have to answer yes, but they're not the same thing, but they're being conflated for a political purpose.
Yeah, you put exactly what I was saying in a much better way. And so then we start looking, I think what you then have to do is look at what governments are trying to do in order to help the situation. So what they're saying is, right, we don't want you to use fossil fuels, so you're going to have to buy an electric car. And then you look at the fact that an electric car weighs at least a ton or maybe more than a normal car, uses a whole load of rare earth materials, and needs possibly fossil fuels to
it is, for want of a better phrase, completely
unsustainable. So then you ask yourself a question: why, critically, are they doing that if it's not really solving the problem? And then you ask yourself, is there another motive as to why they're doing that? And maybe it's just misguided, but you'd think with the research resources that they have, they would, and the fact that they're literally steering people towards this technology that for some might be great if they've got a driveway and do short hop journeys, but for some other people it's an absolute nightmare if you live in a flat and you can't park in your road and you can't charge your car and you want to go on a long journey. It's funnily enough, the other day in the car I was listening to Radio X, and Johnny Vaughan was complaining about his electric car, saying exactly what I'd said about it over a year ago, which I was saying that I was talking to a builder who'd bought an electric van and was explaining to me in great detail how pissed off he was, because he was saying in the summer he couldn't put the air conditioning on because it ruined his mileage. In the winter he couldn't put the heating on because it ruined his mileage. He had to spend an extra hour a day charging the thing because when he'd get back from a job, tired and worn out, he'd have to go to a place to plug it in and wait half an hour overnight, or risk not being able to get to the job the next day, from which, if it was far away, he'd already be sleeping that night badly, worrying about whether he'd be able to get there. I mean, it's just crazy. And you look at what the government are trying to do right now with improving the situation. I would say next time you walk past a flat, look at a big block of flats and think about all the people that own cars and ask yourself, how are all of those people going to charge their cars? And when we need to do this. So it's kind of a strange step forward in why we don't really believe that government are the answer, because I think there may be potentially there's a problem, but if this is the solution, it doesn't seem to be a very good one.
Most of that, if not all, I agree with. So I think climate change is a very complicated topic, and just looking at it through the scope of greenhouse gas emissions is, I think, the wrong lens to look at it. So there's a guy called Howard Dryden who talks about the surface layer of the ocean, and actually the pollutants and soot and even waste from tires being eroded on the roads and then being washed off into waters and then floating on the surface of the ocean, that being a bigger problem than greenhouse gas emissions.
Brake dust from electric cars apparently is even worse, because
the so-called solutions, I totally agree, are completely ridiculous. I mean, if you look at the life cycle of a renewable of a solar panel, it's smelted coal, it's smelted polysilicon in China via coal, and then shipped to the UK because we've banned our coal, so we have to outsource it. And then it has a lifespan of maybe 20 years unless it breaks, and then it goes into a landfill. I mean, nothing about that is sustainable. To call it renewable is a misnomer. But the point is with all of this stuff, just to get back to the solution, is that we don't necessarily have to prescribe what the solutions are. We just come back to this one universally agreeable principle that we shouldn't aggress against each other. And all of this is the definition of aggression I can come into, but whether aggression has taken place is a matter for the courts to decide. And if the courts have decided with fair evidence and a proper due process that aggression has taken place, then how you stop that aggression is kind of up to you. You pay the damages, or you pay the penalty, whatever that is. And then going forward, we're not prescribing. It's like the pandemic, and it's like any disease. All of us have a duty to not spread a communicable disease to another person. But how we do that shouldn't be prescribed, because if I'm locking everyone in their homes, then I am the aggressor. But and because many of the people locked in their homes wouldn't have passed on a communicable disease anyway. Maybe they'd taken some clever vaccine, or they were taking precautions, or they were going to meet people that had agreed to accept that risk. So this is where a top-down enforcement of one solution is always, frankly, it leads to unintended consequences and a waste of resources and an impingement of individual freedom.
I mean, you started with Murray Rothbard, and as a libertarian, I think that the problem that I have with much of this debate is I don't believe there was a pandemic. I don't believe there's such a thing as anthropogenic climate change. I believe everything that's happened, at least for the last 5 years, is an example of big state government overreach to, frankly, fascistic or at least technocratic aims. So when you start, from my perspective, you don't trust the government on anything. And the fact that we've now had one of the most colossal data breaches probably in history that's going to cost, by all accounts, billions. It wasn't Rothbard. I think it was Friedman that said that if you gave the US government control of the Sahara, pretty soon there'd be a shortage of sand. So I think the lens through which I view pretty much everything in this world now is that whatever the problems are, government is the problem more than it is the solution.
Yeah, and this is where we've been very deliberate about our strategy, because we're not against the government. We are against a behavior which is aggression. And
so what is government if not aggression? Because people, the natural state of people, I don't think is to go to war, but governments take people to war for whatever purposes. I think the natural state of humanity is to live in a culture of free trade and peace. So I'm just saying I've got a mug that I think one of our friends bought us a few months ago, and it has that picture of Javier Milei, and I think it says something like, I have infinite contempt for the state. Well, so do I.
I mean, so that I'm not going to say whether I agree or not, because we've taken a very deliberate stance to not be against the government, and this is why.
Well, I'd say then you're guilty of collaboration, frankly. But I don't understand, polemicist. I don't want to be perceived as being aggressive to you personally, because I'm not. But I think if you don't accept that government is the problem here and not the solution, then we are destined not to disagree on these topics.
Well, so it's a question of strategy. And given that most people have a paternalistic relationship with the government, to be taught...
I would now question that. And again, I'm not trying to come across as sort of confrontational, because it's not my intention. If admittedly I have probably a very, let's say, finely curated Twitter feed, but if my Twitter feed is remotely reflective of the broader world, which it may well not be, I concede, then this country is at boiling point with this government, and rightly so.
Well, I mean, I would think that's a good thing. So that gives you a sense of that I basically do agree with you, but I think it can be very confrontational to the people that we want to persuade, because I think libertarian philosophy has done a good job of appealing to the right, but a very, very, very bad job of appealing to the left.
I mean, in the States, it never gets anywhere. Libertarianism is laughed at in America.
Exactly. So this is the solution is that we're not against any individual, group, corporation, or government that is not aggressing. And as you say, it's the government that's the big one, because all of them do aggress. So the definition of aggression is not initiating non-consensual physical force against another person or their property. So that includes theft. So it includes tax. It includes engaging in fraud, coercion, creating a substantial risk or threat of initiating non-consensual physical force. So just pulling a gun on someone is as bad as pulling the trigger in terms of the aggression. I mean, probably don't have the same punishment, but it's definitely an aggression. And then breaching someone's right to due process. This is essential because we can't go around accusing each other of aggression and not have a trial. And then breaching a valid contract. These can be lesser, civil cases rather than a criminal, but an aggression nonetheless. And then engaging in unreasonable conduct. This is where things like pollution comes in, and then breaching fiduciary duty. So if you have a kid, if you choose to have a kid, you have to look after them. If you're in a role of a power dynamic that gives you the advantage, like in a caring role, you have to abide by a fiduciary duty there as well. And that definition, if a government was to adhere to that, which theoretically it could, and that's definitely the reason we're not against government is because we want to. Frankly, we don't own the nuclear bombs, the tanks, the submarines, and the coercive power. So to come at it from a combative stance is likely not to be that effective. Those that do peacefully, we support, but Live and Let Live is not trying to divide; it's trying to reconcile. So that's why we don't focus on the person, but the behavior, because everyone wants peace deep down. And on the question of conspiracy or cock up, obviously it's probably a combination of the two, but I think cock up is probably more common. And I think most of the people I met in the climate change world who are looking for a bigger government, and they're looking for a reduction of individual liberty to achieve their ends, most of them are doing so with the right intentions. They don't realize what a global government, how terrible that would be.
But they only have to look at the history books, because the history of the 20th century shows us that totalitarian governments, firstly, don't work, and secondly, they end up killing millions of people. So all you have to do is look at a history book, whether it's communist China or it's communist Russia. This is why one of the things that most offends me is the idea that the German swastika, the Nazi swastika, is probably banned, but if it isn't banned, it's all but banned in our culture. As far as I'm concerned, the hammer and the sickle should be treated with exactly the same way, but they're not. They're actually effectively being coerced on children through our school system, our education system, and that I find deeply offensive.
Yeah, I mean, you're forcing me to agree with you, and that's fine.
I'm not aggressively forcing you to.
No, you're not aggressive. And actually, it's a good point, because it's a good point to raise now that disagreement and civil discussion like this is not an aggression. So to give you an example of something a little bit contentious that maybe brings this to light, if someone is a vile, selfish, racist, they might not be aggressing. And this is why they might not. So Live and Let Live, our community seeks to be tolerant, open-minded, kind, and civil and honest, not because it's a legal requirement, but because it's
the right way to behave.
It's the right way to behave. But I think it's a good point. So a lot of people would say, well, what about that racist person? Maybe I run a pub or something, and we exclude gays, Jews, blacks, Muslims, everyone other than our a very like white men. We just only allow white men in. We'd say, go for it. Do that. Naturally limit 90% of your customer base, because even
see how well your business thrives.
Exactly. See how well your business thrives. And thank you for letting us know where you are, because when we outlaw mean speak, then we make it it goes underground. It still exists, but we're not able to see who it's coming from, where it's coming from. It's like the war against drugs. If we outlaw the peaceful behavior of putting certain substances in our bodies that doesn't harm anyone else, we just create an underclass of gangsters, criminals, and it doesn't solve the problem. It makes the products dangerous. So Live and Let Live is very radical in advocating that all of these victimless crimes be legalized. But the world would be I think a much more prosperous, peaceful place if we stopped spending so much money just alone on policing all these victimless crimes. Like the law is 300,000 pages long in most, roughly in most countries, 100 times the works of Shakespeare. No human being, not even the best lawyer in the world, knows what the law is. And if you did know what the law was, you'd realize that you're a criminal. Every single adult on the planet has broken one of these arbitrary laws. So Live and Let Live is trying to make sense of the law again by bringing it back to what we've universally agreed upon in most cultures and religions for thousands of years, which is a version of the golden rule. It just says that
do no harm.
Yeah, do no harm. But just enshrining in law a certain aspect of that golden rule, which is that we shouldn't aggress against people.
So I'm just trying to think of this from a legal point of view. Have you heard of the Free Speech Union? Right. Well, the Free Speech Union is set up for that very purpose in the UK, and it has branches now in other countries, and it's something that works on the basis of you being allowed to say what you feel is correct. And as long as it's within the law, they will defend you. They are not, people say they're right on the right, but they're absolutely not. They are, they will defend anyone's legal right to free speech. And even if they don't agree with
it's
that
probably
speech,
especially if they don't agree with that.
That's not the point. Well, exactly. That's the point, is that you should be able to express your view, and as long as it's legal. The problem is that certain companies decide that, right, we don't like the fact that you don't think that, that men can become women and women can become men, and if you say that, we're going to fire you. That's illegal. And most people don't know that. So the company can't do that. Companies do things that they shouldn't do to people. And unless you know what they're doing, you understand the law, you wouldn't know that you have any recourse. And that's why the Free Speech Union is loved by so many of its members, because they're standing up for a lot of what we would consider to be common sense. And they do take on cases, and they do pay
win
for lawyers, and they have their own. And they do win, and they have their own legal team. So, so you'd be surprised how much good work they're doing in the background, and they're trying to influence, government policy as well. And so it sounds like from a point of view of where you're standing, they are doing something in a similar way by standing for free speech and against people who oppress free speech. The argument that let the man who is going to say racist, let him say those racist things so we know who that racist person is. And as long as it's not outside the law, I'm not saying they're advocating any of it. They're just saying, well, if your opinion is this and you say this, people think that if you're offended by something, and they take this to the nth degree, well, you've said something that's offended me, therefore I have to take action, and the police have been misinformed about what action they should be taking by giving people non-crime hate crimes, which is something out of George Orwell. It's just absolutely crazy that so you could have a non-crime hate crime lodged against you for something that you don't even know you've done, and you're not even told about it. It's just somebody has to say that they're offended by something, and they'll effectively look into it and then record it.
The fact that the Free Speech Union even needs to exist in the UK is disgusting indictment of our government. I was listening to Peter McCormack and
absolutely.
Peter Whittle, I think it was, on a podcast earlier, and they're making the point that in America, the right to free speech is enshrined in the Constitution. We have no such right, and that itself is a disaster.
That's exactly right.
But it's got demonstrably worse during our lifetimes, to the extent that we now have words can't express my contempt for our current government and our current prime minister. But the fact that we now have a two-tier system where Islam is now basically a protected religion ahead of Christianity, I think is just offensive to any right-thinking person. I'm not saying that we should have the right, that anyone should be encouraged to criticize Muslims. I'm just saying we should have a level playing field. And again, that free speech should be allowed. But that is not the direction of travel in this country, sadly, tragically.
So just taking it back to Robbie's, do no harm. How does that not come from? Is that a similar thing to what you're saying about? Well, is it a similar thing to free speech? Doing no harm. I'm just trying to think this through. Where is the law got this wrong, and how would you make the changes to the law, or how would you influence it to a way? And let's put it another way. How do we know that what you believe is right when you say do no harm? Because maybe your definition of no harm is very different to my definition.
Yeah, it's a great question, because the definition, so we don't say do no harm, we say don't aggress. And the definition of aggression or aggressing is those 8 points I just mentioned, the initiating non-consensual physical force against another person's property or body, And then the
Right.
fraud, coercion, threats, lack of due process, breaking a valid contract, engaging in pollution, unreasonable conduct, and breaking fiduciary duty. So those, I think, are the contribution that Live and Let Live offers that is most valuable. Mark Victor is a really brilliant lawyer. He's been practicing law as a criminal defense attorney for 30 years. And then the council's been stress testing whether we are correct in these 8 definitions in like hundreds and hundreds of different scenarios. So we feel confident that our contribution is in large part this definition of aggression. We think it's the least necessary and most agreeable thing that humanity, no matter what your views, values are, can agree on. And the world is a very scary place in some ways. The UK is in fact a great place to live compared to North Korea, Venezuela, many other countries. And I'm not defending what's going on in the UK. I think there is a deterioration, definitely. But this is a global problem, and many of the issues that we now face, like nuclear war, even if the UK was fully free and respected this law that we shouldn't aggress against each other, we would still face risks of annihilation from elsewhere. So that's why we do have to have a global approach. So our mission is to align all laws globally with this legal principle that we shouldn't aggress against each other, which is highly ambitious. And it's not a utopia that I can kind of come into why it's still not perfect. We still think it's the best approach that there is for humanity to rally around. And we definitely want to be the umbrella for all of the aligned organizations. So the Free Speech Union, I mean, there are luckily hundreds of organizations around the world that are focused on this same problem. We're coming at it from the most broad to be that umbrella.
So what would be a situation that you'd effectively get involved with, or be your organization would be initiated to do something? Would it be you see a government being aggressive, or a large corporation, or an individual, and then would you step in and say, look, you shouldn't be doing that because of X, Y, Z? Or how do you actually put these
I think
values into effect?
In some ways it's even kind of bigger than that. So we have a systemic problem. Again, the law in the US, the law is 300,000 pages long. So how much of that are we trying to tackle? Well, 99% of it. There are 2 ways to enter the new paradigm that we think we have to enter to avoid some of these existential threats, like nuclear annihilation and many others. And that is there are 2 ways. One, you can have a bloody revolution, which we don't want. The other way is that you can try and peacefully influence the world. And for that, we need a critical mass of people. And for that, we need a very wide and expansive community. Anyone who agrees with this legal principle that we shouldn't aggress against each other, which it sounds like you both do, we are looking for a huge community of 1 billion people that creates that critical mass of people. And for that, we need awareness. So in terms of what we're doing, first of all, we are, Mark's written a book that's going to be published by the end of this year. We're creating online education tools. One day we'll try and set up schools, we'll have events, but all of it's with the purpose of educating on why freedom is important, why the freedom to live your life as you choose is what creates meaning for us as individuals, and what creates an opportunity for us to thrive on a planet of 8 billion people, which many say is too many people. I don't think that's true at all. I think that puts you on the wrong side of history. We can all survive, but we need to stop hemorrhaging money, imposing our morality on each other. The system of democracy is essentially one where the red party's in for 4 years and they impose their morality on other people. They ban many victimless crimes like drugs or whatever, and then the blue party comes in and they impose their morality on the others, and that's things like imposing a monopoly currency and then debasing that currency, taxing. So it's the whole system is evidenced by the debt, evidenced by how difficult it is to make a living. It's unsustainable. So we're very much looking at the big problem, and then the application of those solutions, once the community is large and it has weight behind it, then we can start having a seat at the table. So we have a top level initiative. So we're not top down, because we're not trying to impose anything on anyone, but we do want a seat at the table at the UN and all these places, because it's often there where there is, I think, good intentions, but very, the road to hell paved with those good intentions. So we want to influence there, and then also influence at the very local level. So we have a guy running for Tempe city councillor in Arizona who's trying to implement Live and Let Live at the local level. So it'll be pervasive in every country, with local communities in those countries adopting Live and Let Live. So we'll give them the tools to form their own communities. We're partnering with organizations like the Free Cities Institute, which is looking at things like seasteading as a way of sandboxing local communities that are outside the jurisdiction of these aggressing states, so that they can demonstrate that people can flourish and thrive and be more prosperous when we adopt these principles of freedom. So it's a very wide approach, but the general strategy is ABC: awareness, belonging, change.
I probably don't dispute that any of these aims are laudable, but the image that comes to mind, or the meme that comes to mind, is that of the as long-standing listeners will know, I love my films, and the film that springs to mind is The Day the Earth Stood Still. I don't know if you know it, but it's a science fiction film from the 50s.
I don't know.
And basically, so spoiler alert for the next 30 seconds, but essentially, the New York, I think there's a UFO that lands in New York, and there is a benign alien that comes out of the ship, and before he can even start talking, the army basically shoots him, so he ends up in hospital. But he's come on a mission basically to say to the world that if we don't mend our ways, the universe will deal with us, essentially. And that to me gets to the heart of the problem, which is it is entirely laudable to have these aims, but it doesn't respect the fact that humans are innately warlike and aggressive. So appealing to people's better virtues just sounds, and please don't treat this as a criticism, because it's not, but I'm just sort of speaking aloud. It seems like an overly idealistic ambition.
Well, our motto,
as you said, some countries have nukes and others don't. The countries that have nukes are likely to get their way over the countries that don't, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, nukes is definitely one of the most complicated topics, and arguably there is a peaceful justification for some nuclear bombs existing in the world. I mean, if there's an asteroid heading towards Earth, they would be the tool to help. But our motto is
right now. I'm praying for the asteroid.
Come on. That sounds like a great film. I think I'm going to enjoy that one.
It's an excellent film. It's one of the best. I'd say it's humbly one of the best science fiction films ever made.
Cool.
They made it looks like they remade it in 2008.
So see the original with is it Walter Rennie? It's good.
I bet it's great. But I understand what Tim's saying,
because I mean, like you said, we're all financiers, so I think we kind of know how the world actually works.
So it's what I've always thought in all of this madness, and again, it comes back to where the law stands, because it's been developed through case law, and because to a certain extent, I mean, I've sat on a jury a couple of times, and I actually really enjoyed the process. The process, not necessarily the cases, but the process. I found the judges to be absolutely amazing in the way that they deal with the cases. And it may not be the best system, but I can't think what the best system would be. I can't think of a better system, put it this way. And, everything's considered, and the law seems to be, maybe things go wrong sometimes, but its intentions are correct. I think with politics, there is the problem with politics and the people who are in power,
they're all psychopaths.
Once you voted these people in, and they start bringing in things that you didn't vote them in on the basis of, because they suddenly decide that they want to bring a bill to bring in digital IDs or something like that, which they never said they were going to do, or they don't do things that they say they were going to do. Then how are we supposed to deal with things like that in our society? So if you could take a legal approach to politics, which is what I would like to see, where people have to write a manifesto and they have to have a timescale and they have to say, well, this is what you said you would do, and if you don't do it, you're out, or you get fined, or
if you promise something and you haven't delivered on it in a contract, that's fraud. So I think it's a good approach. Yeah.
Well, not necessarily fraud. It could, I mean, if you promised, if you have a contract to do something and then there's something happens, right, it might not necessarily be fraud. It could be something that's happened outside your control. But do you see what I mean? There's like a legal process, and I think this is where people get frustrated with politicians. And the old joke being, how do you know when a politician's lying? Is their lips moved? I mean, that joke's as old as the hills, because maybe there's a few who are very well intentioned, but there's a lot who aren't, and people just get very frustrated. Some of it is poor information management, and sometimes people don't really understand the problems because they're not communicated correctly, and they are more nuanced, and you'd have to go into a lot of detail. And I don't want to, but I might want to give the government, in certain circumstances, the benefit of the doubt, because it's not as simplistic a problem that you're facing in certain situations. But in other situations, it seems completely clear, and it seems completely clear what the people want, and they don't seem to be doing what the people want. So so this comes down to where I think the crux of what you've said is people living their best lives. Now, if you take the government as a whole and then they're an entity, and they're kind of living their lives in the way they want to live them, that is where things start to differ, because everyone individually might have a way that they want to live their life. Like maybe I want to shout on the street corner with and sing Iron Maiden songs at the top of my voice, and perhaps that's how I want to live my life, but that might not be very nice for you if you're living on the edge of that street. And so, how do we define what living our best life is at the same time? Now, you might say, well, that's aggressing against someone, but someone else might say, actually, I like Iron Maiden and I like the way he's doing that. So no, let him get on with it. So how do we decide those things?
Great points there, and lots of ways to respond. So first of all, the way that the legal system is, the process of the legal system is not something we're trying to rewrite or reinvent the wheel on. Totally agree that the legal system works really well. An independent jury, a judge, we would probably have competitive courtrooms, so that the free market was the free market competition was always improving the standard of justice. But
that's interesting. That's a really interesting concept. But I've never heard of that.
The problem with the law is not the common law. It's not, because statutory law is the problem. And actually, you do need a statutory law at the very root of common law. You do need a statutory law, and the statutory law that we're proposing is don't aggress. And it's so simple that a child can remember it. It's universally fair, but the common law will then evolve, because there are grey areas. That live is not a utopia. Take something like the age of consent or abortion. Reasonable people will have different opinions on whether abortion is aggressing. There are those that say that the rights of the mother the mother has the right to determine what is in her body, just like any woman has the right to determine that they don't want to be raped. It's a similar concept. But then you also have to think about the rights of the being in the body, and where do the rights that to not be aggressed against start. So that's a place where reasonable minds disagree. So there, Live and Let Live would say, let the local communities decide. We're not imposing some overly righteous an objective, correct answer on everyone. And there are a few of these.
But Robbie, so I'm really sorry to cut in, but how can you let local communities decide? I mean, if you live in London, that might be that one area of London has a different definition of when abortion is aggressive to another area of London. Or what if you live out in the sticks or somewhere in Scotland where there's low density of population? And how would you decide there? It could be just like 3 people in a village or whatever. Well, I mean, not 3 people, but you know what I mean? It could just be like a very small amount of people in one area who then have a decision that could be completely different and outside the law, and maybe even, I don't know, maybe even completely, inverted commas, crazy to what we think is fair, and someone could suffer.
So in terms of
that.
What might be crazy, so Live and Let Live says that though there are no definitive objective correct answers on these continuum problems, so like the age of consent is a continuum problem, but there are answers that are clearly not reasonable. So I think Portugal has an age of consent of 14. I think that's unreasonably low, but maybe we could say that is a gray area where we don't impose our law on those people, but 13 we do. So if anyone has an age of consent of 13, then that's clearly an aggression. It's actually basically a breach of contract, because the 13-year-old is not a competent adult to make that contract with an older man, typically. But the reasonable range, I think, is between sort of 15 and 21. You know, if you're saying that a 24-year-old also doesn't get to decide what they do with their body, that's also a form of aggression, but 21 might be reasonable. So the sort of 16 to 21 range is totally fine, and local communities can decide. But outside that range, it starts to get a bit more difficult. And then there's a range, you know, let's say below 14, that is unequivocally an aggression. So Live and Let Live will help define those gray area ranges. But in terms of the local community, there's no minimum size that we would mandate that could form that local community. But there are many benefits of making that community as large as possible, because in a world that we're not paying for public goods via the means of taxation and everything is voluntarily funded, which is a big one we haven't talked on yet, then there's many benefits financially for having those costs shared amongst a wide group of people. But if you live in a suburb of East London or something, and you really strongly disagree with the reasonable interpretation of your neighbors, then there's nothing stopping you from theoretically from forming a local community as a subset. But there are practical implications, and you have to give due notice to all the people that come into that region, and then again the costs of enforcement and the justice system are going to be higher for you. So you may say, rather than form a local community myself, I'm just going to move to Glasgow or Birmingham, where they share my reasonable interpretation of this legal principle. So free movement is probably the way it's mainly solved.
What if you get a religious group who gains sort of power within a certain area that disagrees with you and says, no, actually 12 is okay as an age of consent, but they've decided, but you've said no, and so
this gets back to your point about the sort of the warring nature of human beings. Let me be really clear that Live and Let Live does not tolerate aggression. So if someone wants to
sorry to cut in on this one, if that's the case, what does it do when it comes across that? So what does it sanction?
It sanctions justice. So the right to due process, first and foremost, so a trial, and then a decision and a punishment. But that we don't specify what that punishment would be, but it has to be reasonable. So you can't go around killing someone that trespassed on your lawn or something. It has to be basically the minimum necessary punishment to
proportionate.
Proportionate punishment, exactly. So
do you decide that, or is that a legal thing?
The legal principle defines the maximum. It defines that it has to be proportional. But just like a response to any problem, we don't define how it's solved. We just say it has to be solved. So if a small religious sect has a religious conviction that the age of consent starts at age 8, we'd say, nice try. If you're having sex with an 8-year-old, you're going to get tried in a court that agrees with the principle of live and let live, which is why we need a critical mass of people to because none of this works unless we have a critical mass of people that agree on this legal principle. But once they,
we already have that, and that's the law.
A bastardization of the legal principle if it's based on the legal principle at all. Again, the problem with the law is that many statutory laws have been added on top of this legal principle that we shouldn't aggress. Things like that cannabis is illegal, or prostitution or gambling. All these things that are victimless crimes are illegal in many jurisdictions around the world. And then the law also mandates that you pay a certain of your income, your wealth, to the state so that they can fund all the things that they want to fund, which often themselves don't agree with this principle to not aggress. So the law is totally broken. The way that the laws are enforced through the courts is fine. It's the laws themselves that's really the root of the problem.
But I'd make the point that there's certainly a problem with the legal system, and as you say, the amount of sort of bureaucratic bump that's been added to the system. But it's also a question that the judges can't necessarily themselves be trusted, because I lose count of the number of times I read stories about XYZ who's just raped somebody but can't be deported because he hasn't got any friends, or he'd run the risk of something happening in his home country. And it's like the judiciary, I don't think can be trusted any more than politicians can. So the role of the judge is not trivial, and I think some of these people are. It's really like the civil service, which is sort of power behind the throne, that they seem to be calling all the shots, even though nobody elected them.
A live and let live court would have one principle to enforce, and that would be this legal principle to not aggress, with the 8 definitions. So if a judge was saying things like, we can't punish a rapist because they don't have any friends, it would be so obvious and clear, because everyone from age 5 onwards would understand what the law was. So they wouldn't be able to get away with that, because the law is so complicated today. There's a clause or an article for everything that can kind of be used to manipulate justice, and usually it doesn't go on, because I think most judges they do want the best for society, but it is a risk in today's system for sure.
I'm just trying to think about. There are very complicated situations that require a breakdown of both sides and an analysis that a kind of simple reduction to don't aggress might not work. And again, it goes back to the law. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the YouTube channel, The Black Belt Barrister, but I find his channel quite interesting, where he takes on he talks about these cases, or certain cases, from a legal perspective. And when he's talking about cases, to me, it highlights how complicated situations can be, and how there isn't a well, I'm just trying to think. Maybe you're right. Maybe there is, but certain situations, like for example, I don't know if you saw the situation with this woman who was in Tesco, and she had her she had a self-scan trolley, and a store detective undercover came over and was checking over her items, and then someone from Tesco came over, or maybe she came over first, and then this other guy, store detective undercover, came over, and she started filming them. And the lady from Tesco was saying, "You got to stop filming," and she's like, "No, I've got a right to film." And she's like, "No, you haven't." And they got into this argument, and then she said to the detective, "Look, you've got to show me some ID. I don't believe you're a detective, or show me some ID." And he in that short video, which is, one small part of something, so we haven't seen what else has happened, so we don't know the full situation. In that small part, we just saw, her saying you can't film, and then the Tesco employee trying to grab the phone off, or made an attempt to grab the phone off her. Now, they were analysing that for about 20 minutes and explaining the law about how it was a semi-public place and you shouldn't film, but you can film if under certain circumstances. So you can't just walk in and start filming because you fancy it. But if you're in a situation like that and you want to use it for your own defense, you can film and the judge will allow it. And then he went on to explain how store detectives actually have to follow the same rules as police certain police in certain situations. That store detective has no right to search her bag, her personal bag. Not that he was going to, or we didn't see any of that, and he didn't ask to do that. But I thought that was interesting because I didn't know that. If they want to search her personal property, they have to call the police. Only the police have the power to do that. So what I'm trying to say here is that in any small situation of somebody in a shop and Tesco or wherever it might be, things get very complicated quickly. And the law, not everybody knows where the law stands, but somebody might have been through this situation before and then kind of shakes out who's right, who's wrong, who's allowed to do it. And it's not that anybody there is necessarily purposely doing the wrong thing. They might all think that they are doing the right thing and trying to do the best thing in the situation from their own perspective. But again, their perspective might be misinformed, misaligned, and unintentionally aggressing against somebody else. And maybe they have got the right to film in certain circumstances they didn't know. So what I'm trying to say is that this can get very deep, even in sort of relatively trivial situations. Are you confident you can actually unpick and sort?
That's
sort
the fun
these situations
part,
out.
is taking really difficult hypotheticals and seeing how the principle applies. And this is the game we've been playing again for 5 years, and I haven't yet come across a case that the legal principle isn't an excellent solution for. But this case in Tesco, one thing we should be really clear about is that the private property owner gets to do whatever they want. With that, they get to determine the rules on their private property. So Tesco could say, we allow or we don't allow filming. And if they don't allow filming and someone's filming there, well, then they're breaking the rules of that private property. And then they can be evicted. They can, there can be a policy in place that enforces that rule that Tesco has implemented. So does that make sense? So if I...
Well, no, I know exactly that does make sense, but that's not fair. You see, the problem is that this lady was not going in there just to film for the sake of it, and it's not like being in a concert where you're not supposed to film for copyright reasons. She was just filming to have a record of what was going on because she felt as though it needed to be recorded. And what was really interesting about this case was that what they said was that even if you've in many, like one of the legal guys, it was the black belt barrister and a colleague or somebody he knew from another channel who was a legal guy. What he was saying was that in many cases where somebody has filmed covertly, even if it was illegal, the judge actually allows it because they will say, well, okay, you're saying X and you're saying Y. It's who he said, she said, but you've got evidence to prove exactly what's happened here. And so from a legal standpoint, that solves the problem. And so even though Tesco might say you're not allowed to film, if later on the employee said, oh, no, I didn't try and snatch her phone, well, she can say, well, actually, I've got you on camera attempting to snatch my phone. This is the proof. There are certain circumstances where well-intentioned rules might actually fall outside of that.
There's a couple of things there. One is this the original term semi-public.
Yes.
That's going to be the leak in the bucket there because in a live and let live land, there is the law, which is that we don't aggress, and then every property owner gets to add additional rules. So like I might say, look, though I see that people taking drugs is not an aggression, I myself in my house have a rule that says no drugs. But the key is that you need to give proper notice. So if Tesco is going to have a rule that says no filming, it needs to be very clear for people entering the Tesco stores that the rule of that castle, the Tesco castle, is that you can't film. And then if someone is filming, it's not a semi-public issue. It's the Tesco said no filming, and now you're filming. And then so Tesco might say, look, I understand in this occasion, it was for a good reason, so I'm not going to press charges or anything. But it's really comes down to what the rules are that are set on that private property. And because today everything is semi-public, we're all part of our income is paid to the state against our will. We're semi-slaves in that way. So thinking about these situations in today's world is much more complicated. But if you imagine a hypothetical where we have adopted this legal principle to not aggress against each other, there are still definitely difficult cases. So for example, a difficult case would be, when is it right for someone to exercise self-defense? There was a good case recently in America where a driver was aggressively driving through a primary school, through a car park 3 times, just 3 very fast laps through a primary school car park, which itself was, unreasonable conduct causing harm. So that in itself might have been a cause for aggression. A security guard who was armed with a pistol went after this car. The driver stopped the vehicle, got out running, and extremely aggressive, shouting, went for the security guard's neck, was throttling him on the floor and saying, like, I own you, like I control you, you're nothing to me. And then he starts saying, shoot me, I dare you, shoot me. And the security guard pulls out the pistol, shoots him dead. Whether that was proportional force, the judge ruled that it was. But these cases are difficult, and there would be other cases that are even more difficult to determine whether the self-defense was right or not, because this aggressor was unarmed. He was just using his brute force against an armed man. But still, the judge thought that was clear. But I think your point in general is that in real life situations, every situation is unique and has different variables that need to be taken into account by the jury and the judge. And that's why, again, Live and Let Live is not a utopia. Some of those decisions, the justice may not be perfectly administered, but at least we're starting from a premise that makes sense to all people, that we at least are trying, we at least are adhering to this principle of not aggressing against each other.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think how... I'm still trying to work out how that's different from what the legal system is trying to do anyway. Like, say in that situation, how with the one with the car, the car and the guy getting shot. I mean, if someone's got their hands around your neck, you haven't got very long before you pass out. So it would make sense that he'd have to do something. And so I can see why, even though he was unarmed, he was possibly trying to kill somebody. And so you can with your bare hands, and that's why lethal force was probably and obviously the guy was possibly slightly unhinged in what he was doing in the first place, because that's like, maybe he was on drugs, right? And maybe that's why people shouldn't be taking drugs. So it gets more complicated, doesn't it? So how would you get involved with a case like that?
So, I mean, there we wouldn't really need to, because, again, the Live and Let Live, the rule that we shouldn't initiate non-consensual force against each other, most of that is working well. So we already have a rule that we shouldn't rape, assault, murder, and we shouldn't thieve. It's just that, to your point, Tim, your contempt for government is well founded, because it is that group in particular that doesn't adhere to this rule, particularly that we shouldn't steal from each other. So it's the universal application of this rule that we shouldn't initiate non-consensual physical force that's the area that we need to implement. And then initiating non-consensual physical force against someone who has not themselves initiated physical force is itself an aggression. So, for example, again, if I'm drinking alcohol in Dubai or whatever it is where I'm breaking the law, if I haven't hurt anyone, then I'm not the one initiating physical force. So if someone locks you up and puts you in a cage for doing that, then they are the ones that are initiating physical force. So there are many statutory laws that we wouldn't change. We might reword them to make them a bit simpler and to make them apply to all groups, including the government. But it's mainly debribing all the rubbish from the law that's going to be the bigger task, and then enforcing some that are not currently enforced. For example, in the US, most pesticides and fertilizers are deemed not to be pollution, but they cause eutrophication of the waterways, and they harm property elsewhere. So they're causing property damage. So this arbitrary determination of what isn't, this ability for the government to say, oh, that's not aggression, or I'm going to override your freedom and aggress this way. That's more the thing that needs to be dealt with. So largely taking laws out and adding a very, very few.
So I just want to ask a very quick question. Yeah. On the guy that got shot, what if his family came to you and said that the security guard had been an aggressor against him?
Well, I'd say, if you want investment advice, come to me. But I'm not a judge. I wasn't the case. I'm not on the jury. I can defend the rule that you're not allowed to initiate non-consensual physical force, which this guy was clearly doing, and that the flip side of that coin is that you can self-defend, and you can outsource that self-defend to a security guard. If you feel like the judge got it wrong, then you can appeal. You can appeal to a higher court. There would be Supreme Courts under Live and Let Live, and for every court above, for every higher court, the interpretation of the rule would be more broad, so that there couldn't be a creep of power to because if it was the other way around and you could take a more strict definition, eventually what you'd end up with would be a one world government, but that government would just be a court system, and then they'd be making arbitrary laws at the top level. So that's why it needs to be more broadly interpreted. But that would be my answer.
Does Live and Let Live have any aspirations to become a political party?
So we don't ourselves, but we want to empower people to do so. And that's why we have an ambassador program. So the ambassadors of Live and Let Live are those that deeply understand the message, represent us in this tolerant, respectful, civil way, and then we can empower them to run for office. So again, we do have one politician in Tempe who's running at a very low level political seat on the city council. So we will set up a slightly different charitable entity that allows support of political parties, because our 501c charity can't do so currently, but we're in the process of doing that.
Funnily enough, I was out walking the other day and a thought popped into my head about if I was in a country where they didn't allow alcohol, like a Middle Eastern country, how would I feel about that? And I don't know why it's this just coincidental to this, because I didn't know we were going to be talking about something like this. And I came to the conclusion that if those are the laws of the country, then I shouldn't go to that country. And that's just kind of the end of it. Doesn't that come back to what you were saying about the guy in the pub? And if he decides that only white men can go in, then that, so be it, let him do that. It seems like you're applying the rules slightly differently to countries or to politics than you are from a local level.
If there's anyone in Dubai that wants to drink alcohol peacefully, they should be allowed to secede from this wider community. That a group of houses can get together and form a housing association agreement that says no alcohol on our premises. But that's the key here, is that it's voluntary.
Yeah,
when it's coercively imposed, that's the difference.
Okay.
But this is biblical, because it's like, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God. So, you have to kind of, when in Rome, you have to kind of respect the local tradition.
Exactly. And that's why, again, we're not saying don't pay taxes. We're not saying we are definitely not advocating breaking any of the Caesar's laws. We're peacefully trying to amalgamate a critical mass of people that say in the next election, we want to elect a party that is fully aligned with Live and Let Live. And that's going to be a very radical change. But that exactly, Paul, exactly, Tim, sorry.
What if, a group decides that they, I guess we can do a lot of what ifs, and we will obviously move on from it. But I'm just interested in situations which again are a bit like there's a fine line. Like in some cultures, you can have multiple wives, and in some, obviously that's not legal in this country. Would a Live and Let Live community be allowed to set themselves up so that they could do that? Would that be okay in say the UK?
Totally, yeah. If there's no victim, so if these wives are voluntarily agreeing to this arrangement, then who are we to say that they can't do that? That's the key. It's the same for things like euthanasia. Who are we to say you can't end your life? I mean, what an imposition. So yeah, it does get quite radical. You can have totally crazy rules on your own premise that if people are voluntarily signing up to, that's totally fine.
Yeah, I guess the problem there is then if you are, if the people who are signing up are vulnerable in some way and need protecting, but then I guess you could argue, if they're happy, then maybe they don't need protecting. Maybe they just need leaving alone. And that's a difficult one. I'd have to really think about that.
So Paul, it's a good point, but this is why we're very clear that about competent adults. So these rules apply for competent adults. So if an adult is not competent, or they're too young, or they don't have the mental capacity to form a valid contract like that, then it would be an abuse of power. It wouldn't be a valid contract, and therefore enforcing that contract would not be valid. It would be a breach of the legal principle.
But like say in cults, you have somebody who effectively gets brainwashed. They use psychological techniques, and so that person might be thinking that they are actually acting within their own free will, but they're not. They've been sort of coerced, but they just don't know it.
It's funny you mentioned that one, because I had the same thought, and it's a good reminder. So every month the council meets and we discuss these kind of grey area topics, and I think I want to bring this one to the council because I had the same thought, and I suspect that I'll message you what they say, because I don't want to. Okay. I don't want to guess it.
Yeah. Okay. That'd be really interesting. Would I be able to put that in the comments for people later on? Would that be okay? Yeah. Okay. Great. So after the show, we did get an email back from Robbie. He was as good at his word, and I will put the details in the show notes and also read it out at the end. So thank you very much for that, Robbie, and on with the show. So what is the plan then? How are you going to... Obviously, you need more people to hear about this project, and it sounds like it's got to be a global project, and that's why you're thinking so big, because it's something that, if we're talking about different countries, different cultures, this has the potential to be huge, right?
It does have the potential to be huge, yeah, and we've really been in stealth mode for the last 5 years, and me joining is the beginning of ramping up and becoming public and really trying to exercise that global ambition. So it's going to be very difficult, and I can construct a sensible portfolio. I've never built a global peace movement before, so I'm kind of winging it.
Amateur.
Yeah. But I think our aim is really just to win hearts and minds. This ambassador program is very key, because each one of us has our own community of people that we know the language of. We know how to resonate with those people. So to empower ambassadors to go into their local communities and spread the message and form local Live and Let Live chapters that are exercising to the fullest extent that is currently legally possible a free way of living together. We really want it to be a community that uplifts each other, supports each other. So we've built a business directory for people to advertise their services, their products, offer jobs, so that we're a community that's helping each other. Kind of like, there's lots of other communities that do that. Not that we have any affiliation with the Freemasons, but that's, or the I'm trying to remember in Salt Lake City, what's the religion that they're...
The Mormons.
The Mormons. The Mormons do this pretty well. They voluntarily pay 10% of their income as tithe to the local community, and that's shared out. So they've got a model there for how we can voluntarily support those in more need than ourselves. And we will set up a podcast. Mark's book is going to be very good. It's quite long. It's also 300 pages, but it's a very, very clear implementation of how this legal principle be applied. Things like competent adults, things like the gray areas, to how the local communities implement these rules, and it even goes into things like stoicism and why some voluntarily adopted moral component to our lives is important, but not defining what that should be. So that book's launch will be in January 2026. The podcast will launch in a few months. We are going to go live with our membership portal, which allows all these businesses to advertise, and we're going to try and target young people particularly. So students who are facing a very uncertain world, they've been brainwashed with lots of unhelpful ideas. That's really our target audience. And again, it's why we're not anti the government, because that audience in particular, they've spent 10, 15 years in state school systems. They're not going to be so receptive to this idea that the government is evil.
Oh, you don't know though.
We don't know. I mean, some of them might, but yeah. Schooling is an interesting one, because I think that's a huge imposition of freedom to force everyone to study the same curriculum. As a dad, I'm very one of the reasons I want to set up these schools, the Live and Let Live schools, is because I want there to be much more freedom in education, so that people can learn actual practical skills, rather than, the model today is that we end up in huge amounts of debt with degrees that are not particularly useful. And then we struggle to find a job, and then some people never pay off that student debt. So I think healthcare, education, there are so many systems that can be improved by Live and Let Live, and it is a very, very ambitious project. So we've just got to start small and really focus on the value of anyone that joins, and trying to maximize the benefits of them doing so. Start seeding these political people around the world, and have local chapters in all the countries around the world that understand local problems there, and form political parties to address those problems. But yeah, it's a huge thing. It could be a huge thing, and I'm definitely dedicating my life to it becoming huge.
Well, a man's reaches grasp, or what's a heaven for?
Exactly. Was it Browning?
I think so.
Yeah. And our motto, aim high, fall short, do well, means that we know that we're going to fall short of our goal of global peace in this lifetime, but we're just doing something to increase the odds.
Right. So you're just being the way, basically. That's the way forward.
Be the change you want to see in the world.
That's it. Yeah.
And how do you envisage, say, sorry to go back to the legal stuff, but I'm just I'm curious. I think the education areas.
I think Paul was swatting to become a barrister.
Yeah, I think I should have done it if I was to go back.
It's not too late, Paul. It's not too late.
I absolutely love the legal stuff. I guess it's anyway.
I think you just like dressing up in wigs.
like
a woman.
Well, that as well. I'm not letting all my secrets out. So when it comes to how you see yourself kind of dovetailing with the legal system, how would a situation where, say a judge has made a decision, and I mean, I'm guessing AI and technology will help you along the way with a lot of this, because it will not replace, but augment the manpower that you have, especially at the start when you haven't got enough people to do the work that you've got. But let's say you've got a judge who's made a decision, you think that decision is wrong. How do you get involved from that point? How do you make change? And you talk about influence, but influence is one thing. Influence is only if you have power. And if people think you can't really do anything about it, they might agree and say, Live and Let Live have got a point here, but we're not going to do anything because you're not going to do anything to us. So why should we change?
Yeah. So I think the awareness one is probably the main one for now. So again, we don't have the power. We don't have the guns, the tanks, and the nukes. So we will be.
You're stockpiling them, basically.
Stockpiling them. We are definitely going to be leveraging the awareness tool mainly. So commenting on social media, just explaining what a Live and Let Live application of that case would have been. But then later down the line, maybe Tim and Paul will set up the Live and Let Live UK party, win the election, and then implement this principle that we shouldn't aggress against each other. And the transition question is a big one, because of all the unfunded liabilities of the government, and most of those things like pensions, social security, many of them were legally obtained. So the contract is that you give your money through the national insurance contribution to the government, and they give it back to you later on. Well, there's nothing. We shouldn't punish the people that gave that money under that agreement. So the unfunded liabilities of the government pose a huge problem for us as Live and Let Live implementers.
But there's no contractual obligation there. It's assumed that that's a liability of the government that needs to be honoured. But the reality is, everybody knows they're just going to devalue the currency. So the repayment, which I don't think is a legal obligation, is in entirely notional terms.
Yeah,
you need to be fairly, living in a cave to think that you're going to get a decent. I mean, I think anybody that has expectation of getting a reasonable pension now within the next 10 years plus is just living in another world.
Yeah, I unfortunately agree. But let's just say the Live and Let Live party in the UK was successful. Okay, so now we implement this rule that we don't aggress, which means that if we were being absolutist about it, all tax would cease on day one. But that would cause total chaos. And we have the NHS that people are very reliant on. So a responsible transition would take many, many years, where we would have to ratchet down the tax and never allow it to increase. We'd have to decriminalize all these victimless crimes. But these things would have to be responsibly implemented over time. And there's no one right answer for how that would be done. So another thing we'll do is set up a transition council and basically start the debate of what the optimal ways of doing it. I think there are some really creative ways we can do it. But that's to be honest, the hard part of Live and Let Live is how we go from A to B once we're successful in winning the hearts and minds.
I was thinking about the Georgist way that we learned from Akhil Patel and Phil Anderson and Fred Harrison, who talks about a land value tax, which basically is a way of funding everything that everybody needs with one single tax. You get rid of all other taxes, but just have this one tax. And when I first heard about it, I thought, well, that sounds like communism, but it's not. It's basically saying we all have to occupy space in order to live. And if you allow a few to control the rent of certain land, then basically you end up with a kind of monopoly situation, which applies to lots of different areas. And the capitalist in me, the free market capitalist feels like pushing against it, but it is actually well thought out. It would be fairer because you wouldn't need to pay any tax at all. You'd actually get a dividend from the government. Everything would be so much fairer, and the whole economy could thrive because people would be able to do things that are productive for the economy rather than because they have to pay rent to certain individuals rather than to the community as a whole. So it sounds more like that idea is in keeping with your general idea of not aggressing, because being an aggressor could mean buying up all the land in a certain area and then charging everyone huge amounts of rent to live there.
Yeah, well, just on that very last point, we would say that's not aggression. And there are many social ways that we can punish people. So, and that's a very important point, is that social means of punishment that are not themselves aggression are totally allowed. So boycotting a business. So let's say let's say Tesco it has such a stronghold on the food industry in the UK that it becomes a complete monopoly. Well, a complete monopoly in a live and let live world would be solved by people just boycotting that business. And instead,
hang on, you can't do that because there's no other business to turn to.
So you'd have to. A monopoly of an industry is the perfect environment for an entrepreneur to come in and offer an alternative. And that entrepreneur would likely be well received by the community that was being extorted by the monopolist. So a sustained monopoly in a free market is very, very difficult, which is why even things like OPEC, who are a very few number of players and themselves coercive institutions, they fail to function as a kind of monopoly. The incentive is always for competition to flourish. But I think in the UK there is a valid question of the most villainous of barons of our ancient times have still a disproportionate access to the land as a benefit from their aggressions of hundreds of years ago. I think that's a very difficult question. And then this land tax might be a good solution in the UK as a transition scheme, but it has to be very clear that the end goal is for there to be no tax at all, and we just have to define the ratcheting down process. So maybe the land tax. I personally quite like that Georgism idea as a solution for an interim. But I think where I would disagree with them is that it should be the way that things are going forward forever. I think it has to be very clear that, tax is theft, and the theft is aggression.
But let's take another example. Let's say I wanted to create a rivalry to YouTube. Let's say I'm Rumble and I try and do that. It's virtually impossible because you would need so much money, and the advantage that they have would make it almost impossible. And part of that issue is regulation. And also, if you created another company that was a rival to Tesco, there's a very good chance that they would just buy you out. And it wouldn't.
You do need to accept being bought out. You don't have to.
But that's the thing. If you're talking about a societal level, yeah, great for the company that went along and tried to make change, but then ultimately they'll get corrupted by that monopoly, and that's why the governments should allow fair play. And the reason why what I found really surprising was after the financial crisis, the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, I thought we'd have a string of new banks opening, new names that would have a clean balance sheet, that would do exactly this, that would keep the other banks honest and actually sort of potentially run away with the business, because people would trust them more and think, well, you haven't got a lot of, arcane products on your balance sheet, and you can start from scratch, offer better interest rates and from a clean sheet. But in order to open a new bank is so difficult from a regulatory point of view. it's virtually impossible.
It's almost as if the regulator is acting on behalf of the incumbent banks and against the interests of new competition.
Well, this is the problem.
One of my favorite quotes to Hoary or Chestnut is, "What is a regulator? A regulator is someone who waits until the battle is over, then waddles onto the battlefield and shoots the survivors."
So this is a problem that needs to be addressed if you want proper competition. Because of this regulation,
the way that we would address that is remove all these victimless crimes in the forms of regulations. Like, why, if I cannot earn the minimum wage because I just have no skills, I maybe haven't had a shower in a few weeks or something, and people frankly don't want to pay me 12 or 13 pounds an hour, but they would pay me £5 because I might be worth £5. If I'm willing to accept £5 and someone's willing to pay me £5. But why? Where's the victim there? Why can't I accept £5?
Well, the only real minimum wage is £0.
Exactly. Yeah. So the actual minimum wage is £0. But so I think Dunbar's number is relevant here because it is difficult to operate a business when most of the people in that business have never met each other, don't know each other. I think if you remove all these regulations and allow competition to flourish, and you don't need a license to set up a bank, and you don't need to follow all these arbitrary rules, and there is no bailout if you fail, then I think competition and different approaches can flourish. The bailing out and the moral hazard of, I think fractional reserve banking is not an aggression. Bailing out when it inevitably fails is the aggression.
Yeah. No, exactly. No, I totally agree. And the book that Tim recommended to me and talked about for a very long time before I got around to reading it.
That's unlike me.
Was Sapiens, which I absolutely love. I think it's absolutely brilliant and everyone should read it. And I think it should be like a book that everyone should read at school. But one of the most interesting parts of that was the Dutch economy and how it thrived through business. And the Dutch ruled the world at one stage. And this was without government. It was only when government came. I mean, whether it's a coincidence or not, it's kind of hard to argue that they helped if they ruled the world and then they formed a government and then it all went to shit. But that's what happened. So it just makes you think whether the libertarians have got it right and whether we don't need government. You do need, national defense, and you do need a certain, you need certain things like policing and what have you. But apart from that, the more the government gets out of the way, maybe the libertarians have just got it right.
The American model has private policing as well. I mean, an alternative is actually anarchy, which gets very bad raps. I think it's misreported and misunderstood. But my understanding of anarchy, which I'm increasingly looking more favorably towards, is it's not no rule, it's just no rulers.
Well, how would, I mean, the word libertarian, does that jive with what you're live and let live? Is there anything about the libertarian idea that you disagree with, Robbie?
The marketing approach.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's totally
the
fails.
Optics. Okay.
The optics. Their motto is "Don't tread on me," and surprisingly, that hasn't inspired hearts and minds. So most of us have come from a libertarian background, but we are distinctly different. One of the ways is that we have a more complete legal proposition, because most libertarians are economists and Mark is a lawyer. So I think the legal principle and how we define aggression is really coherent and valuable. But then it's also, we do take an effort to be voluntarily kind, compassionate, tolerant, and all these things. And the libertarians place no value in that. And I think it's really, really important. And it's probably why it's failed. But at the heart of libertarianism, it's the same principle. The non-aggression principle is the same as our legal principle, except that our definition of aggression is slightly more full and durable.
So a good would I be correct in saying that you're trying to create a community that shares these values, whereas you think the libertarian just thinks, I just want to be left alone to do what I want to do? Would that be fair?
Right, exactly. Because most people are not libertarian, and most people feel like the world without state-funded goods is a very scary place. And so in order for that to be, in order for freedom to be an appealing proposition, we need to demonstrate that we would care for those less fortunate than ourselves, not because we're forced to, but because it's our gift to be able to, and create a community that is looking after each other, as a demonstration that this could work, and help local communities be the example of this new way of living. So the libertarians, we generally, they're an ally.
So when it comes to funding and obviously your background was financial, and you've totally, have you totally switched? Are you now, is it all live and let live, or do you have your eye in the financial side of it? Do you have time to do that?
I've always loved markets. Again, I kind of got into it with a view to understanding sustainability, but soon just really, really loved investing and studying markets. And I find that markets, and particularly overlaying technical analysis on top of markets, is a really good way of understanding what is and might be happening. So I think for my own enjoyment and to keep that skill set alive, I will continue looking at markets, but I am full-time on Live and Let Live, and we're funded by Mark, but we will need funding for growing the movement, but the core team is funded by Mark. And Brilliant. We can come on to markets. I did think about it before coming on, just in case you wanted to add on it.
I'd love to know what you think.
I think it's very difficult at the moment, and I never have particularly strong conviction on the macro, but I always start with the macro, and use some principles and technicals to form that view. And for the last year and a half or 2 years, have been expecting interest rates to fall, as the pervasive narrative seems to be that inflation is sticky. But so I've been kind of maybe right for the wrong reasons. We were maximum bullish since November 2023, particularly on long duration stocks, in anticipation that interest rates would fall. Interest rates haven't really fallen; they've kind of gone sideways. But we were rewarded for that positioning anyway.
How did you come to that conclusion? That's really left field.
Yeah, it's actually Elliott waves, which are definitely much more art than science. But Elliott waves, and also the sort of fundamental view that inflation was largely a product of shutting down the global economy, because we've been printing huge amounts of money since, well, even before 2008, and it wasn't particularly inflationary then. So thinking that money printing would more cause the Cantillon effect and asset price appreciation more than CPI increase. So
Elliott wave on the stock market, or Elliott wave on bonds and interest rates, or both?
I'm so habituated to seeing them everywhere now that but particularly on the TLT long-term bond ETF. So around, and also not just Elliott waves, also looking at RSI divergence, trend lines, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
As an investor, I'm very much more is better. I'm neither a growth nor a value nor a fundamental nor a macro nor a technical, but all of it.
Okay.
And it seemed that the decline in the TLT ETF looked a bit exhausted around November, and frankly, since being maximum bullish, then it was always a difficult conviction. It was always a conviction that gave me a lot of stress, and I second guessed it a lot. But I think right now, one thing that does worry me, if you draw a long-term trend line from 1930 to 2001 or 2000 on a log chart of the S&P 500, you get a trend line that we bumped up against in February, and then the S&P dropped 20%. We're now back at that trend line again. And I find those really, really long-term trend lines quite useful. And most people look at trend lines on the kind of daily chart, or sort of, on a minute and and daily charts. But I think monthly log charts is where they're most useful. And just as it was back in February, I didn't really know why the stock market would sell off. I didn't know what the reason would be, but that trend line being met gave me cause for concern. So whether we fall a bit and then come back and re-hit that trend line could easily happen. But I do see the divergence on the RSI as being a corroborating concern for that bullish stance. So I think right now, if you like me still have a very uncomfortable view that interest rates are likely to fall before interest rates are falling first, maybe over the next year, continue to trend sideways or slightly fall, then, obviously generally you'd want to be owning growth stocks, but I think those growth stocks are very overvalued now. So I think it's a very difficult market, and I think idiosyncratic investment cases are what to be looking for. A company that I like called Helios Tower, not investment advice, and actually don't have a position myself, but I think that's interesting because it should benefit if rates fall, but it's also a very idiosyncratically interesting company with exposure in high growth markets like the Congo, and it sells Selco tower coverage in those African countries. So it's the least levered and fastest growing and high. It's got increasingly high return, cash flow return on investment from here. So it looks quite expensive now, but the earnings are just coming through. I think companies like that are quite cheap are ways to express a conviction on a long duration play. But at some point, I do think there will be a commodity boom, and I haven't. I know oil prices have been rising over the last few months, and I'm sort of expecting them to fall before rising. But then when they do rise, that's obviously going to be the catalyst for inflation to come back and interest rates to start rising again. And at that point, I would be super bearish on anything that's not commodity related.
Again, is that Elliott wave? Sorry, just to confirm your thought process.
It's Elliott waves, and also it's always Elliott waves and fundamentals and wider technicals. And the wider fundamental view stems from the fact that, much to the chagrin of my environmentalist colleagues, I do think that fossil fuel usage will be pervasive, and again, because we are making so many stupid decisions with our energy system and relying on misnomer renewables, we will probably end up using more fossil fuels. So as low prices solve low prices, but also a war against fossil fuels will probably mean that the demand ends up exceeding the supply.
Well, the war against drugs doesn't seem to be succeeding.
Exactly. Yeah.
So precious metals and cryptocurrencies?
Again, those things I have been quite bullish on. I can see, I think silver of the three, just to throw that one in, would be my top choice, because as the most conductive metal on Earth, it benefits from what's going on industrially. It also has that monetary property as well. Cryptocurrency, I've been a kind of fairly bullish mostly over the last since its inception, or since I was converted to the reasoning behind it around 2014. But I've been very disappointed with the actual utility of anything outside of Bitcoin. So I think most of it is a scam, and that industry will not be a great place to invest. But I think some small proportion allocated to Bitcoin does make sense, and that is historically been very cyclical. So right now, I am a bit more cautious on, I'd be kind of looking for a top in Bitcoin, maybe not quite yet. Probably gold continues to go higher, but if over the next year housing starts to really show signs of weakness, I know it already is in the UK, but I think if the housing leg of the stool drops off, then generally I'd be quite bearish, and bearish on gold as well, because it would be a source of liquidity. But then, inevitably the money printer will start working, and then gold will probably be a great place to invest after that catalyst.
I was thinking about the arms race of AI and how it's going to develop. And I know obviously a few people, especially Tim, have been very bullish on precious metals. But I was thinking, what could supercharge silver to go higher? And it's exactly that. The fact that it's the most conductive metal. And if we're going to have literally an arms race in AI, then it could become extremely valuable. And it would only take someone like Elon Musk to decide that it might be a play. And then it sort of reminded me of the bunker hunt corner that happened in the 1980s, and whether something like that could potentially play out. Because it's like a second order effect of trying to control the technology. But I don't know. I mean, that was, I'm all technical, but like you, I sometimes come out with ideas that have a fundamental basis. But Tim and I have discussed it many times, and I think Tim knew it before I did, that silver was the best conductor of electricity out of all the metals. It's just not used because copper's pretty good and cheaper. Copper prices have just exploded into new highs, and silver hasn't really. So it's like, also noticed palladium, which had done nothing for a long time. Dave Hunter, who was very bullish on silver and gold, when I remember asking him what he thought of palladium and platinum, and he was like, well, no, not really interested in those two. But technically, they made bases very recently, and they're now moving up, which to me is the green light to a broad precious metals rally, because in Dow theory, when everything moves together, then you get a true bull market. When everything's not moving together, it can be an individual bull market, but it's not what we call a structural bull market. So now we've got all the components of a kind of super trend, if you like, in commodities, especially in precious metals. And the Bloomberg Commodity Index Futures chart looks very much like it wants to break out, or is in the process of basing that could have a lot of upside. So whether the markets go or not, I think technically things are starting to look really very, very interesting.
Would you say that our long-standing thesis has basically been that we're living through the 1970s again? Would you agree with that? Either of you?
Robbie,
don't all answer at once.
So, sorry, I think there was a slight delay on the line. I don't think it was a reticence to answer.
I have no strong conviction that that's true, but I think it makes some sense.
I mean, I suppose what I'm getting at in part is also one of the things that was seminal in the 70s was the fact that the monetary system changed in 71, and it feels to me like the monetary system is about to change. We don't know exactly what might come next, but it's probably not going to be King Dollar as the sort of unipolar center of the universe, because $37 trillion of national debt would argue against that thesis.
Yeah, but is it the cleanest shirt in a very dirty laundry?
I know for sure. So I don't dispute the supposition that the dollar will be the last fiat standing, but I'd rather own gold or silver for that matter.
Whether it's the 70s, I don't know, because we haven't got the rampant inflation. And in fact, what surprised
me... Not yet, but I mean, firstly, the inflation figures are lied about anyway. And secondly, to quote Friedman, inflation is always never a monetary phenomenon. The money's been printed, so, and I think it'll... I think I'm channeling David Hunter now, that either way, I'd strongly suggest that when the market correction, the big market correction comes, it will be met by money printing on a scale that you'll be able to hear from Mars.
Yeah, well, to that end, Trueflation, I just saw on Twitter, I think yesterday, was showing that inflation was actually less than was shown, which
that sounds like bollocks.
Well, I thought so too. I was like, hang on a minute, I've never seen it that way. And Trueflation, I thought, was always showing that it was higher.
Well, what is Trueflation?
Well, I think it's just an independently calculated level of inflation. I'm not saying
in globally or in the US?
I think in the US, I think they have measures.
They've clearly not gone for a drink in London recently.
Yeah, exactly. But it depends what you put in the basket. But I'll have to. I mean, look, I'm not an avid follower. I don't follow it that closely. I just see occasionally that Trueflation have said, X and the number's been Y. It's not that I follow it religiously, but it just shocked me that it went that way. And then when Robbie said that you were thinking that interest rates would go down, I wondered whether there was some form of underlying inflation measure that I'm missing, because Dave Hunter's saying exactly the same thing. He's saying rates down, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense at the moment. But maybe it will. I mean, the bond market's yields are just consolidating here, and interest rates haven't dropped. But
would you see a sympathetic? Would you take sympathetically the idea that take the long interest rate cycle? Interest rates basically were in a bull cycle from early 80s through to 2020, and they're now going in the other direction. And these things tend to last 30, 40 years, so they're not short term. They tend to be long term secular trends, and basically look out below if you own bonds for the long run now.
I think your thesis that we could be up for monetary change of some kind is so on the money, because we've got this new technology that is actually a rival to fiat, and it needs to be implemented by governments. It's not a question of whether they want to; they have to, because you can't.
And I would assume Robbie's also supportive of that as a sort of libertarian, because that would be my argument, which is let 1,000 flowers bloom. Money's too important to be left to government.
Yeah, there's no problem with printing. Printing, having a currency, offering it, and then printing loads more of it isn't an aggression. Forcing everyone to use that currency is the aggression. But yeah, Tim, I definitely share your view that I think the long-term trajectory for interest rates is higher. It's just that it seemed to me that there was a very clear 5 waves down from whenever it started in sort of March 2021 maybe, and that 5 waves was finished, and so potential wave 2 from up and down is the wrong term for use with interest rates, because I'm usually thinking in terms of looking at the TLT chart where down means up, but a corrective wave now followed by a continuation of increasing interest rates over the longer term. But I was also looking at Trueflation, Paul, back over the last few years, and they were early to foresee inflation rising, and then they were early to see it falling. So I do find them quite useful.
Yeah. That would make perfect sense. I mean, I'm going to use inverted commas when I say perfect sense, is that interest rates drop, and then we get this boom, and it's the final dropping of interest rates, and inflation starts to get out of control further down the curve. So on any lowering of interest rates, because the government say, because of tariffs or whatever situation or whatever numbers they were going to turn to, either in the US or here or wherever, they start to say, well, we need to lower interest rates in order to support the economy. But that will be the last cut. And then the bond market will start to go, hang on a minute, you ain't going to be dropping them anymore. And this is going to be adding fuel to the fire. And so you start to see the long end go, but it might take a while before the market turns over. So I think that's a reasonable kind of working model for how things might move forward. But I also think that the only way that they could implement a cryptocurrency, a government cryptocurrency, or however you want to describe it, would be in a crisis, and we're pretty much approaching 1929, 2029. By 2029, there's 100 years from that. I mean, as a cycle repeat, very possible that we're going to see some form of major correction, and whether that will be used as an opportunity and links in with what Tim's thinking about a currency change is I think those two are coming together, and it seems very likely that is how things will be implemented, which could make precious metals even more important. But during the crisis, as Tim said as well, people use gold as a cash machine, so it may well go down a lot during the throes of it, but then afterwards it might be that people flock to it. And also Bitcoin might end up as a safe haven as well, which is an interesting one that I'm trying to ponder. Will people run to Bitcoin if they see the government trying to impose a digital currency? And it seems likely. So then what would be their next step to stop you doing that? I suppose they could impose laws, but, hopefully Live and Let Live will step in and stop them doing it.
We will.
Can't argue with a confident man.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I was just like running my thought process through
No.
But these seem to be the moving parts that we need to be looking at over the next few years. And it's really hard. I was talking to a very good friend of mine who's in America, and she's sadly going through a divorce, and she's looking to buy a house. And she was saying, I know what you think about, what's coming up, but I don't think if I asked you whether I should buy a house, she said, I was worried that you'd say, no, I shouldn't, I should wait. And I was like, well, the thing with buying a house is that at least if you've got it and you own it, the bank can't take it off you. In a crisis, it might go down, but at least it's protected. But the problem is, if you've just sort of liquidated your assets in a divorce and you're sitting on a large amount of capital, you then end up with a problem of where can you put it and safely store it? Is it government bonds? Is it in gold? Is it in a bank? It's certainly not in a bank if in the UK an account over 85,000, if the bank goes down, you're not going to get any more than that. That's the deposit limit.
They'll probably just print like they always do. So.
Well, this
more
is
a question of having an inflation hedge.
Now this is a really interesting one, because my barber is a fantastic trader, and he listens to Bloomberg and all of this stuff. And we were having this discussion, and he said, well, what they might do is what they did in Cyprus, and you might be forced. Bail-in. Yeah, you might be forced to convert your deposits into shares. And I was thinking, that really does make sense. But trying to work out what they're going to do next, or could potentially do, because of course this is the time when you've got to be thinking about these things. Even if it doesn't happen, it's like you've got to be 2 steps ahead, because by the time you're thinking about it, if it's happening, you've got no time to work it out. Mm. But that bail-in, and also there was something on a Joe Rogan podcast where they're talking about you don't own shares anymore.
It's impossible to own, my understanding, and Robbie may be able to confirm this, but my understanding is that it's impossible to own shares in certificated form anywhere in the world now. All you can own is dematerialized shares, which is not the same thing.
I don't know what that means.
So basically, if you can't buy share certificates. If you want to own shares in BP or Nvidia or whatever it is, you can own it in electronic form, but that means they're vulnerable to, let's say, sequestration.
Yeah, if they decided they didn't want you to have it, they could just take it away.
Exactly. I mean, this is the whole thesis of the Great Taking.
So in the same way that you could buy a film on Amazon Prime, and then they could just decide that, no, actually, you're not. We haven't got a license for that. Sorry.
Well, exactly, because I remember I was listening to, I don't know, what was it? It might even been our discussion we had with Fergus O'Connor Greenwood a couple of years ago. But I've never forgiven Jeff Bezos for the fact that I bought the first series of the X-Files on Prime some years ago, and then I think the ownership must have been sold to some other platform, possibly temporarily. So the next thing I see is just gone. It's just disappeared from my account. I paid for it, but it's just evaporated. And he cited the example of someone who had a pop quiz. He said someone had a Kindle and they had a book on it, and the book mysteriously disappeared. Can you guess what that book was?
1984?
1984.
Nailed it.
But I think, Robbie, we've probably taken too much of your time.
I think we've moved effortlessly to media picks.
I think we have, if you're okay with that, Robbie.
Let's do it.
Yeah, was there anything that we didn't ask you that you wanted to say?
No, I think you guys asked excellent questions, and I would just say that we haven't yet launched, and I think we are at the point where we're just enjoying these kind of discussions. And if anyone would like to reach out to me and chat about anything that I've mentioned, just do so on LinkedIn. We definitely are looking for ambassadors, people that can champion this message and spread it into their communities. And then later down the line, maybe sort of October to January time, we'll start actually releasing things, getting our website, podcast, and books out. So look out for them down the line.
Well, it's Live and Let Live. So it's live and then AND letlive.org. So it's an easy website, which we will put in the show notes. And definitely we'll have you back on when that happens. And if you want to promote the books and let people know what's happening. But we will end with your handles and remind people again. But let's just do the media picks part, if you've remembered that bit, Robbie. We usually start with Tim. So if you haven't, you can think of one. Tim, have you got one for us?
I do. So this is actually via one of our listeners, I think via Paul, who suggested it. And it's a book called The Falsification of History, Our Distorted Reality by John Hamer. And this is basically quite a nice companion piece to another book that's now become a personal favourite of mine, which is 180 Degrees, Unlearn the Lies You've Been Taught to Believe. And The Falsification of History covers very, very similar ground. Basically, we've been lied to forever by everyone about everything.
And yeah, so a listener actually asked whether we'd heard of it, and I
hadn't at the time.
And so in between, you've read the book. Yeah. That's fantastic. Blimey, that's good going. So was there anything in it that wasn't in 180 Degrees, or
no? I think they covered very similar territory, just from a slightly different perspective. But I think Hamer's gone on to. Well, I don't know where this ranks in the timescale of the author, but I think he's written numerous books, and there's another one that I probably will. Well, I think I probably will get it, but I think I know what it's going to say before I open it, and it's The Falsification of Science.
Right.
So he's, as I say, it's coming very, very similar ground. But have you heard of 180 Degrees, Robbie?
I've heard you talk about it, and I think I would agree with a lot of it, but I haven't read it.
Because I hesitate. It's a difficult one because I hesitate to sort of recommend it wholeheartedly to people, because I found it so unsettling reading it and I think I was already well down the rabbit hole when I opened it. So I think there will be some people that on contact with 180 Degrees, their brains are just going to explode. So I recommend it with reservations.
Yeah, it does sound good, and
if you want to be persuaded, have a look at the Amazon reviews, because firstly they're almost universally extremely positive, but it's more specifically the fact that, and I would be among the number of people that say it's the best book they've ever read. It's that good.
I love it. I'll check it out.
And I speak as an English graduate, so I've read quite a bit over the years now.
Robbie, what have you got?
So this one's an old one. It's a film by a lady called Nina Taylor called Sita Sings the Blues. Sita Sings the Blues.
Oh.
Have you heard of it?
I don't know. Actually, I don't. I would say no as a reaction, but for some reason it rings a bell, and I'm not sure why.
So she's a very controversial lady. I really like her ideas. She's done a TED talk called Copyright is Brain Damage, which I think is very convincing. And she's made this film. It's a telling of the Ramayana, the Hindu sacred text, but in her own she tells it through her own personal relationship with a guy who basically dumps her. And she writes the entire film herself. She does all the animations, all the production. She uses songs that are old enough to not be copyrightable. So they're all these songs from like the 1920s, 30s, 40s. And I think it's just amazing to see a film fully made by one person, and it's very personal. It's, I think, funny, tragic, and a nice portrayal of unconditional love. And
is it an animation?
It's an animation.
Yeah, got it. 2008, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, 7.6 on IMDb.
Good
brilliant.
Score.
That's brilliant, and it's won some awards as well. So fantastic.
And remind us the title again?
Sita Sings the Blues. So the story is, the Ramayana tells the story of Ram and Sita is abducted by a kind of demon god in Sri Lanka, and then Ram.
It is based on a true story.
Well, that bit is I won't comment.
Is it a little bit like the Bhagavad Gita? Is it?
The Bhagavad Gita, yeah. I mean, I find all these things true in a mythological sense. In the same way that Pinocchio has some truth to it, and in that way quite useful. But I think Nina, she is a feminist. She's a TERF. I don't even know what that stands for, but she's therefore quite a controversial figure. But she retells it from the Sita's perspective, and I think she just does it in a really beautiful way. And also I do, I think in Live and Let Live we debate whether intellectual property is indeed property worthy of protection and legal rights, and I'm falling more on the side of copying isn't theft, but that's another topic. But I sympathize with her from that perspective.
Mine is The Edge, a film called The Edge, which Tim, does that ring a bell with you?
No.
Okay, good. So it stars Anthony Hopkins. It was made in 1990.
Oh, I like Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah, made in 1997.
Oh, never heard of this film.
Yeah, so Anthony Hopkins, Alec Baldwin, Elle Macpherson, and the story is an intellectual billionaire played by Anthony Hopkins and two other men struggle to band together and survive after getting stranded in the Alaskan wilderness with a bloodthirsty Kodiak bear hunting them down.
We've all been there.
I know. The bear scenes are absolutely amazing. Like,
are they as bad as the what's the Leonardo one?
Remnant.
Yeah, the Remnant. Bad as in good. I mean, they are. It's like, how did they do that? I just don't know. It's amazing. But a great story. I really enjoyed it. And Anthony Hopkins, you can't really argue with him. So a little gem. And I think it's a terrible name, though. The Edge is a
very forgettable name, isn't it?
Very forgettable,
very forgettable.
Which is a shame because it's got some great lines in it and it is enjoyable. So if you get a chance, check it out. Robbie, thanks so much for coming on the show and giving us your thoughts, and also telling us about your new project, which sounds extremely exciting. Remind everyone where they can find you and of all your handles.
Yeah, I've basically had a abstinence from social media to try and avoid distraction, but LinkedIn's a good one, and then I will ramp up the social media again later on. But LinkedIn, Robbie Miles, and then the website's even simpler than that, www.3l.org, and that'll redirect you to the main website. So yeah, thanks so much, Tim and Paul. Really appreciate having me on.
So just to be clear, it's www.ll.org. Is that what you say?
It's the number 3 and L, so just 3L.
Oh, 3L. How did you get that? That is...
Yeah, it wasn't too expensive, actually.
Really?
But you probably mugged somebody for it.
Yeah, we just coerced them into it.
That's right. Give us it. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, fantastic. Best of luck, and we look forward to hearing about your success and look forward to having you back.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Robbie.
So here's the answer from the council regarding the cults question that we talked about earlier. How the legal principle don't aggress applied to cults. Truly voluntary acts between consenting, competent adults never violate the legal principle, even if harmful to the people involved.
If coercion or fraud has occurred, or if the victim is not a competent adult or involuntarily drugged, then it breaches the legal principle. The exact point at which psychological manipulation becomes coercion is an area where reasonable minds do disagree. Therefore, local communities must define the point at which a breach occurs within a reasonable interpretation of the legal principle. Absent any threat of force, inverted commas, he told me to do it, alone cannot be reasonably deemed to be coercion. But techniques like sleep deprivation, hypnosis, or other manipulative tactics used with the intent to deprive autonomy or property from the victim can reasonably be deemed coercion. Another reasonable interpretation might be that words alone never amount to coercion, absent physical threat, when the plaintiff is a competent adult, i.e. does not suffer from mental illness. This highlights one difference between live and let live and libertarianism. Live and let live does not seek to have the right answer to such grey areas, but instead identifies where reasonable minds disagree and allows local communities to interpret their own reasonable definitions. Otherwise, perfection becomes the enemy of the good. The other difference is libertarians place no explicit value on high character as the ideal accompaniment to freedom to achieve a peaceful society. A pernicious cult is in breach of the moral component of live and let live, even if formal legal consequences might not be appropriate. Please do email Robbie at 3L if you're interested in hearing further about live and let live, and if you have any further questions. Thank you very much. So we put the full text in the show notes as well. That's Robbie at 3l.org. That's the number 3, the letter L.org. Thank you very much.
Thanks everybody. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Please do your own research or contact a professional advisor.